Okay, I am returned. Oh, Arg, thank you for posting all the helpful links for me in chat. Yeah, so we do turn our segments of Talk Story to Me into a podcast, which you can find on Spotify, YouTube, Apple. If you want to catch any of the past author interviews we've done, or if there was a live one you want to make and couldn't, they usually come out a couple of days after the live stream, just because it depends on timing and my ability and will to sound edit. But yeah, so far all of the authors I've asked on have been authors I know, and tonight's no exception. I personally know Brenda, so it'll be really cool, like, catching up. I haven't gotten the chance to talk to her in a really long time, so I'm super excited to have her on. She's such an amazing writer. She's absolutely brilliant. I'm so excited she agreed to it. It is so weird because, so the way I know Brenda is she was my thesis director when I was doing my MFA program, and it is so weird to go to this person you, like, have so much respect for and who you really admire and be like, hey, so, like, I like VTube and I talked through this, like, anime girl model, and, like, do you wanna do a casual, like, interview with me? Oh, I'm not gonna show you my face, though, because I don't want to share on stream. Just don't worry about it. So that, it just felt so weird and awkward, like, asking her to come on, but super excited. I'm hoping I can get her husband, Micah, to come on at some point, too, because he is also brilliant, and he was also on my thesis committee. And they're just such good people. They're such a funny couple. I love them. But yes, I'm so excited. But so far I've only invited authors that, like, I know on to talk, but I really want to start reaching out to authors I don't know, but I already get so nervous before our Talk Story to Me segments. I don't know why, because I know all these people, but I get so nervous. I don't know why. I want to do a good job. I want to make sure they have a good time. I want to make sure you guys have a good time. I just want it to go well. I want it to go well so badly. But eventually I would love to start asking authors I don't personally know, like, if they'd be willing to come on. Like, I think that'd be so exciting. I'm ready to learn. You should be ready to learn, Shadow, because Brenda is not only, like, a brilliant writer, but she is the most amazing professor I have ever had. She's so good. And she's the kind of person who will, like, casually just say something that is, like, absolutely mind-blowing. Like, oh yeah, of course, as you know, something incredible that I, of course, did not know until this moment. And then I'm just sitting there reeling, and she's, like, still going on because, like, to her it's just like, oh yeah, of course, of course. I'm ready to ask questions. Good. Ask questions, chat. It does take some pressure off of me because sometimes, like, I worry about whether I'm asking, like, good questions or, like, if I just sound stupid. Also, I feel like it probably makes our writers really happy when I can say, oh, we have a question from chat. It shows you guys are, like, interested. I feel like it's uplifting for them too. Oh, I'm nervous. I don't know why I'm nervous. I get this way before all of our interviews. I have a pile of sticky notes that I write questions on during the interim when I think of them. Excellent. 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 Oh, okay. I think it's about time to start. It'll be like a few minutes early, but I don't think she'll mind if I, like, jump in. All right, so I'm gonna see if she's in the meeting. Brenda!
Hi.
Hello! It's been so long.
Hi. I know. You don't have purple hair now, do you? I like your emoji.
Not in real life, but
Avatar.
for here I do. You're gonna reveal to everyone that purple is not my real hair color. How could you?
Oh.
But hello, welcome. So everyone, I would like you to meet Brenda Peynado, today's guest author. She's the author of the short story collection The Rock Eaters, as well as the novella, novel, novelette, novellini, Times Agent. So, would you like to introduce yourself for everyone?
Sure. I'm Brenda Peynado. What do you need to know about me? I'm a Capricorn, and I teach at the University of South Florida at the moment. Creative writing, fiction, science fiction, fantasy. I am Dominican American, and Times Agent is set in the Dominican Republic. And my husband, Micah Dean Hicks, is also a science fiction and fantasy writer. He leans more towards horror, and his novel is Break the Bodies, Haunt the Bones.
Oh, also an excellent read, and just a fascinating look at so many things. But we are not here to talk about him today, but maybe in the future. So, I guess let's start with how did you get your start in writing? Like, did you always know you wanted to be an author, or was it kind of something you discovered?
Right. I took the very long way around to writing. For one, for a while I wanted to be a lawyer. I'm very argumentative, and so I thought this was. And then when I went to college, I actually majored in computer science. So I worked for a while in computer security before going to get my MFA in fiction. And then since then, I wouldn't even say even that has been a straight shot, because after I graduated my MFA, there were a few years where it was not looking good for writing.
Oh.
And for so it took me a while to find my way. Eventually, I did a Fulbright in the Dominican Republic that ended up being research for a lot of the book that I'm currently writing. And then I did my PhD. And then from there, I would say things sort of fell into place.
Well, I feel like that's always so inspiring because I feel like so often you hear about writers who talk about, oh, I knew since I was like 3 years old I wanted to write. So it's just very encouraging that like you can find your passion for something so late. Not even so late because you weren't like in your 60s or anything when you found it, but like you can like kind of dawdle around and like it's okay and you'll eventually find it. I feel like that sounded so bad.
That, yeah, no, I think one of the things is I was always interested in writing. Even though I didn't know I wanted to be a writer, I did always write. Um, and so I never thought it would be necessarily my career path, or at least not in the beginning, until it felt very urgent for me. So for me, it was a matter of urgency. There was a point I was working for IBM, and I remember really just having a moment like, I don't care if every data center in the world went down. And that was a bad thing to feel when I was working in computer security. But I do care if I keep writing. And there was that moment where the world really cares if the data centers go down. But nobody in the world cares if I keep writing. And having that moment where I realized that it didn't matter what everyone else cared about, but what mattered, what I felt like was urgent. Um, and then I was really, to me, both sides of myself in terms of, I'm still very argumentative, still very logical, but still very, and there's the same part of me that was engaged when I was programming, when I was like thinking through the logical steps, when I was, trying to set up a honeypot or trying to crack security of something, is the same part of my brain that's engaged when I'm thinking about world building and the logic of something that I've built in a science fictional world. And I still get to use that same part of myself. It's just it looks very wildly different on the output.
Yeah, because I feel like you don't normally equate like either like coding or like you mentioned wanting to be a lawyer originally. You don't generally equate like either of those things with something like creative writing, which feels very free form as opposed to the others, which are very like rigid and structured. So that's such like an interesting way of putting it that you still feel like you're using that same side of your brain just in a different way.
Yeah, you're still creating, but world building requires such intense logic and puzzle building that to me it
Mm.
feels like a very left brain thing that I'm doing when I'm thinking through after the initial creation, and I'm thinking through exactly how this world is going to roll out, the novel thing of science fiction that I've put in there, or the way that magic works and magic systems work. Um, it feels just like a very fun I love.
That's so interesting. So, do you think if you couldn't write like fantasy or sci-fi, like if you had to, for whatever reason, write just realistic fiction, do you think you would find it just as fascinating and interesting when you're not having those like structural world building logic puzzles?
Me personally, but I do think that realism can be just as much of a logic puzzle. I mean, if you have a family that is a very intricate family or a relationship that you've built between, a group of friends. Like I'm thinking about there's a Lori Moore story called I want to say The Burning House. And it's got this couple in the middle of it, and one, maybe both of them are having an affair. And the it's a house party with a group of friends, and it's so intricately woven with the way that they're all interacting with each other. So I definitely think realism can be that way, and I've written realism often, but I didn't really start to feel like writing was joy instead of work when until I started to sort of let myself free and say, okay, people are going to fly in the story, and that is okay. Because in my MFA, that was generally frowned upon,
Mm.
or it was not encouraged.
Oh, sorry, your mic keeps breaking up. What'd you just say?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're
Um,
fine.
my, let's see. Um, my writing didn't really enter joy until I started letting my characters let loose and wild and fly if they wanted to and do magic if they wanted to.
Oh, and I feel like you do such an amazing job of incorporating magic with realism in so many of your stories. So I'm gonna go ahead and transition into the Rock Eaters, which is such a wonderful blend of like kind of this whimsical, magical feeling with incredibly hard realities. And I guess like where where do you generally start with a short story? Like, do you generally have, or any story actually, um, like, do you start with like the magical concept or kind of the theme or the ideas that you want to portray through characters? Like, how do you kind of get your start?
Yeah, every story is different. So some stories it is an image, some stories it's a line of dialogue. Um, there's a story in the Rock Eaters that was it wasn't working for a really long time, and part of that reason was that I had thought of it as a realist story. And in the story, people have their sorrows sort of grow on them as literal tumorous stone. The moment they have their first sorrow, they get this tumorous rock that sometimes falls off of them, or sometimes they have to carry it their whole life. But that story started off as just me thinking about this town that I visited with a then boyfriend, and the way that everybody in town sort of, it was such a small town that everybody knew each other's family stories. And I actually didn't know there were places like this in the US. I always thought of this intricately woven society where you knew the stories of everybody's families. I always thought of that as a Dominican thing because my family stories that work that way are from back on the island. And then once we came to the US and Tampa, all of that sort of fell apart because everybody moved and scattered to all kinds of different places. So I was fascinated by this town, and I started writing it about this girl who moves into town, and I didn't know what the plot was. I kept like, okay, she's gonna she's gonna get a job. She's gonna steal something from the register. I kept just inventing these things that never ended up working until finally one day, years later, I was sitting on a hammock and daydreaming, and suddenly I was like, oh, what if it's literal? The thing that I want her to experience, which is the way that people see everybody's sorrows and know the story behind them. And in this case, it's physical and it's on them. And so everybody knows, oh, they've got their first sorrow. And now we all know what that is. And now it's part of the lore. So that was a story that it started off with just this feeling of something I wanted to write about, but it didn't really click until I got yeah. And then there's another story in the collection called The Kite Maker, which is about aliens that come to Earth because their homeworld has imploded, um, or been eaten by their sun. And when I first thought of that story, it was an image. I just was daydreaming again, and in my head, I got this image of these aliens singing in a park while they're flying kites. And I thought, oh, like what a beautiful image. But after I come up with whatever it is that starts me off on a story, I kind of think that stories can either make you cry or make you laugh. And I am a terrible humorist. I can't make anyone laugh.
I don't know, you just made me laugh.
And I know, right? In person, but on the page, it's just crickets when I try a joke. So at least I always aim for heartbreak. And I think, what's going to be heartbreaking about this image or this conceit? When I thought of those aliens singing, I was like, okay, what would be heartbreaking about this? I'm like, okay, it's something they lost. They lost their homeworld. They're singing for their loss. And then I was thinking, okay, but I don't know that I want to write a story from the point of view of aliens and getting really into like being alien and that all the customs on that alien planet when I'm really wanting to talk about Earth, which is where they've landed. So then I thought, okay, somebody's watching them thing for their lost homeworld. And what would be heartbreaking for this other person and about, what they've lost. And so from there I came up with this character who she feels guilt when she's watching them sing because she feels responsible for some of the tragedy that happened to them. So then the story unfolded from there of just this woman with the huge guilt that she's constantly trying to offload and amend and is sort of prodding these aliens and trying them to get them to forgive her for what she's done.
That sounds like such a nice evolution of a starting point and like really letting it sink in before you kind of develop how you want the story to unfold. Oh, we have a question from chat. So, when you're coming up with applying logic to something such as magic, how do you start that process? Do you go through an if this, then this kind of method, or something else entirely?
Yeah, okay. I have a few rules about magic system, which you don't have to take any of these rules. It's just something that helps me. But one is I either got this maybe from Brandon Sanderson or maybe Orson Scott Card, both of whom I teach in my sci-fi and fantasy writing classes. But one is, what is the cost of magic, or what are the stakes of magic?
Oh,
If
sorry.
somebody can,
Sorry, you broke up a bit. Could you say that again? I'm so
oh,
sorry.
yeah, I got this from either Brandon Sanderson or Orson Scott Card from their How to Write Science Fiction Fantasy book. In the case of Orson Scott Card, and Brandon Sanderson has a great lecture series online. Um, but one is, what is the cost of magic, or what are the stakes of the magic? So if the magic is just something that is like whimsical and fun, but it doesn't really impact anything, then to me, that's not really a fantasy story at that point. The way that I write it as a magical realist story where the magic is just background. It's not really about the magic, it's just a fun thing that happens. Um, but if it's going to be serious and if it's going to have consequences, then I think about what are going to be what are the consequences not just for the character to to practice magic, to learn magic, um, to become part of a group that does magic, but also to be part of a society. And how does that society view the people who learn magic, do um, who are novices in magic versus experts in magic? And also, I think about, is my character going to problem solve using the magic? And then that guides me to think about how much I need to explain about the way magic works. Because there are lots of books where there's magic, but the magic is something that sort of happens out of the nether. And the main character, magic is happening on them, but it's not necessarily something that they can actively problem solve using. So if that's the case, then I don't really explain it much. It happens like weather happens, like why when it rains and it pours, we don't have to explain the nitty-gritty of clouds and how that works in our world. So to them, magic would be like the weather. It storms, it causes horrors, hurricanes happen, but you don't have to explain it for the story to happen. On the other hand, there's something like, when Harry Potter calls his Patronus, he's problem solving using the magic spell, and so we need to a certain extent understand how it works. We need to see them practice that particular spell, understand what could go wrong and what could go right. So those are some things that I think about when I'm sort of thinking about a magic system.
Oh, I love how in depth you go, like thinking about how the magic is used in the world as well as like the characters. Like that's just such an intriguing way. I feel like I've never been that intentional. But I love that. And I feel like that very intentional like way of thinking is what makes so many of your short stories so effective because the magic is not ever anything that can be removed from your stories without taking away like so much meaning. And I think that is such an integral way of incorporating it into your stories. Uh,
And it's really fun. If you like logic puzzles, like this is the way.
so, going back to the Rock Eaters, how I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. I guess how did Rock Eaters itself come about? Because originally it was your stories were published in a variety of journals, right? Did you always intend for it to come together in a collection, or is that something that just kind of naturally happened?
Yeah, the collection is the dream when you're a short story writer because you can write short stories all day and then you think, but I want a book. Wouldn't it be nice if this were a book? And first, I, I think at that point I had published 40 or so short stories.
Oh, wow.
And so getting the collection published was just a matter of figuring out, at that point, winnowing what stories should stay, what stories felt older and maybe not like what I was writing anymore. It was really interesting having written so many stories over the course of about 10 years or so and seeing maybe a little bit less, maybe like 6 or 7, and seeing how much I had changed over the course of writing. And a lot of my early stories were realist, and a lot of my later stories were a lot more surrealist. And so figuring out, honing that down. And when I submitted the story to my editor, it was maybe 400 pages or something like that. So we ended up cutting about 10 out of the uh, 26 or 27 stories that I had originally sent to her.
Oh, wow. And is there, like, do you think those other stories would ever become their own short story collection, or do you think that was kind of a one off for this collection?
I think most of them I don't know that they belong in a collection at the moment. They're either feel so old that it would feel weird to bring them back. Um, it would be like a revival. A few of them were just so weird that it would have to be the right short story collection to put them in. It's just so weird.
Hearing that from you, now I'm curious, because I still
How
remember the.
weirder.
Yeah. Like, delightfully strange, I would say. But
Yeah. There's a short story that didn't make it into the collection where people are in a traffic jam for 1,000 years. And that's not the weird part. The weird part is that there's a traffic jam because there's a construction and it's a mound of these like weird workers that hatch out of eggs. And at one point the main character like goes to the construction zone to like find out why it can't be done and watches them hatching. That was the weird part, I think.
oh, so it sounds like I-4.
It was You are somebody who's very familiar with the Tampa Orlando corridor. Yeah.
Oh, so, someone said a traffic jam of 1,000 years sounds like my personal hell. Yours and all of ours. Oh, so that must have been really hard, like selecting which short stories. And did you have to make, like, you mentioned that some of them were older. Did you have to make any, like, drastic revisions to any of them, or were they pretty much all ready to go and ready for the collection?
Yeah, I had to revise them a lot. And it was something that I didn't expect because, I mean, I always expect to revise, but not once the story's published. And I always kind of feel like my stories aren't done, even after they're published. But there are a few of those short stories that had been published once and gone through the editing process once, been reprinted a few times, had won awards and been reprinted then in the award anthology and gone through the editing process there. And even then, like these stories had been reprinted like 5 times. And when my book editor got them, she was like, it's not right yet. You still haven't nailed it.
Wow.
And there was one story that I didn't include in the collection because we couldn't sort of agree on what would make it work. But for the most part, she was she had just X-ray vision for what makes a story work and what like wasn't quite there. And these stories were, some of them were rewritten from scratch that had been published several times. And I rewrote them for the book because she
Wow.
was right. They didn't work.
Wow, that's
Yet
impressive.
it's a weird experience to have, in short story editing, it's usually we like this or we don't for the journal. And people are willing to edit some, but they aren't willing to say, I love this story so much, I want to buy it and completely rewrite it, please. People aren't for a short story, but that happens with book editors all the time. They're like,
Mm.
yeah, love you. I love this story. I love your vision, and I'm going to buy it and put money behind it, and we're going to publish it, but please rewrite it again. And that's just okay. And you're like, okay, and you have to really trust what that editor thinks that final version could be for you to say, absolutely, I will throw away everything that I have written up till now to try to
Yeah.
make the best book I think it could be.
I guess I never realized that. I always thought like journals would tell you like if a story wasn't working and ask you to like make major revisions. I never even thought about like the difference of that. Oh, someone's
There's a lot
oh,
of good stories that they could, if they had not enough stories to put in an issue, they would. But they have so many stories. Why would they pick the story? It had to be written from scratch versus the one that they felt like already worked. And I think
yeah.
that's the difference.
Someone said, I feel like sometimes your visions never end, so it's so amazing to have somebody in your corner be able to direct it like that. Yeah, that has to be reassuring that someone has already said, I'm willing to like buy your book. I've already bought it. And I have faith in you that we can make this even better. That must be very reassuring.
Yeah, if you have a good agent and a good editor on your side, I feel like you can do anything. All you have to do is produce the first drafts, and then they tell you they can there.
Yeah, but then you have to actually do the revisions.
You have to do the work. Yeah.
Oh, do you have any, before we move on to Times Agent, do you have a favorite story in the Rock Eaters collection, would you say, or one that you are most emotionally attached to?
Emotionally attached, I would say all of them, because each of them, even the wildest ones that are in there, came from a heartbreak. Like each one was molded from a heartbreak. I won't tell you which ones are the most autobiographical because I think you'd be surprised. But I think the one that is most interesting to me is probably, it's hard to pick your favorites. I would say
Hmm.
the first one in the collection is
Oh.
interesting to me about gun violence. But it's weird. There are angels on rooftop that people um, pray to or ask for intercession. And in the midst of this, there's a school shooting, and the two young girls are trying to.
Oh, I think you broke up a little bit at the end there.
Ah,
I'm so
um,
sorry.
oh no, I wonder if it's my headphones, but these two young girls are trying to make sense of this school shooting, but in the midst of these angels that sort of sit on every rooftop and they can ask, it's sort of their patron, and they can ask their angel or pray to their angel to make their day go right or spare them from anything horrible that's happened. And I think one of the reasons why I like that story the best is just this overwhelming sense of bewilderment. Like, what does this violence mean? And how can we stop it? And these girls trying to make sense of something that does not, and having the story reflect that for the reader, just this very bewildering experience.
Yeah, that was such a strong story to start on too. It I feel like it really in a way set the tone for the rest of the collection, not only because it did center around that sense of loss, but I really loved how you went about that story with there is never at any point like I feel like it would be very easy in this day and age to have a story about gun violence and have it almost feel like a lecture, but the way that you go about it, it is so much about these characters, these families, this grief that is so personal, and it never feels like you're coming out and saying like this is right, this is wrong. It is always up for the characters to experience and kind of try to puzzle their way through it, like you said, with that sense of bewilderment. And I just, oh, I love that story. It's so good.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I wrote that story the first year I met you,
At
possibly.
Parcels, you
Or
did.
yeah, and it might have been, or it might have been the year before, but it was the year that Hurricane Maria came. And that same year was the first year I started teaching, and at a university as an assistant professor. And one of the first things they did was they give us gun violence training where they had us all crowd into an auditorium and they give us tips on how to survive if a school shooter walked in. And one of the campus police walked in and with a gun and gave us tips like those elbow, um, what are they called? Basically, auditorium doors, when they open at the top, if you look, they have like little like elbow hinges to
Oh,
keep them
yeah.
together. Apparently, take off your belt and wrap it around those elbows, the door can lock. If the door doesn't have locks, it holds them tight. So tips like that about whether or not to run or what to do from there. And I just worked on that. That was one of the first experiences of my teaching. It was about, like how to put down one of your students if they decide they want to shoot you. And I just felt just so bewildered at like how did we get here?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, on top of that, and some of the things I was hearing. But anyway,
Yeah. I mean, that's not the kind of training you expect as a teacher, sadly. But I I can see how that would create such a strong impression on you to create that short story. It's just one of those things that sticks with you forever. Uh, so, would you like to tell us a little bit about Times Agent?
sure. Times Agent is a novella, or a very short novel. that is set in the Dominican Republic, and it is about a researcher for a time institute where they discover that there are these small little pocket worlds that also have time dilations. So it's not time travel um, in the everything goes, you can go backwards sense, but more about time travel in sort of an Einstein's universe where time and space are related and you can't ever go backwards. But she's a researcher and she's in her glory days. Everything seems like it's going right until she makes a mistake and steps into a world that she should never have stepped into and has to deal with the consequences with time, fast forward 40 years later, and everything that happened while she was gone.
Oh, such. How did you come up with such a cool concept?
Yeah. Well, that story was, I think, inspired by, it started off as a short story. And I don't know if you've read Kelly Link. She's got a story, at which collection it's in, called Light, where it's one, a kind of one of many conceits in the story where there are these little pocket universes. And there are also people who fall asleep for the rest of their lives, and there are also like shadow twins and all kinds of cool things in that story. Um, but it got me thinking about the idea of like, what if we had a multiverse, but instead of a multiverse of universes, we had multiverses of these tiny little worlds that you could step in and vacation in. And so that's probably where the idea started, and it started percolating in my head at the same time as I was considering whether or not to have a kid. And I do have a kid now, but at 5 or 6 years ago, I was very unsure. And I was thinking about why would I bring a child in the midst of all this grief, of all this sorrow? Am I the right person to shepherd a child through it? Um, and so it's a lot about the world, and if you could have a do-over and just step into another world with a child, what would you do? And what would you give them? And what would you want to give them? So this was my sort of rumination. What would happen if you had a child and you could give them any and give them any world? And as part of that, I also started thinking about AI, and um, I also had to think about what I thought the ills of the world were, what she would be trying to run away from or trying to fix. And so that's the story ended up being just a giant contemplation of what I thought had ruined her world and our world, and what to do, where to go from there, and how in the end to have hope even when you're looking those sorrows in the face and your own complicity in it from in the face.
I feel like that's an especially relevant book these days. But how did you kind of wrangle all of, you described them as ruminations, how did you kind of wrangle all of that into, I guess, a plot? Like, how did you decide, like, how this would go as a story as opposed to wondering about all of these things?
That's a great question. I had a hard time with this plot. In the beginning, I have the first chapter is her. She's got her daughter who is now, and her consciousness is in a robot dog because something terrible has happened. And she is trying to give her daughter a perfect day. And that's how I originally thought of the story. She's trying to give her daughter a perfect day. She has an infinity of worlds available to her, and yet something goes wrong every day. So she keeps resetting her daughter's um, consciousness back to rebooting it back to its original boot um, um, stasis. And every day something goes wrong. And so I had to think, what goes wrong? And that in and of itself was kind of the perfect plot because I just had to give her something to strive for, which was this day will go perfectly, and then have something go wrong. any number of things can go wrong from there. For having that many worlds available to her gave me a very easy setup for the plot where she steps into a world and then she steps out of it. She steps into a world with hope, she steps out of it with a with this enormous failure. Um, and it ended up giving me a plot structure that looks a lot like a pearl. Um, how do you call it? Like a string of pearls.
Okay. And is was that kind of your intention from the beginning, or is that just kind of how it shaped out? Like the way, the more you wrote, the more you kind of realized, oh, this is the perfect plot, or was that something you kind of knew from the beginning going in?
I didn't know it from the beginning. I knew I needed to reset her. The thing that gave me the hardest time wasn't the plot. The plot, I felt like once I came up with the conflict, I more or less where the plot would go, with the exception of the ending, which was incredibly difficult for me because it's got fluid dynamics and dilation, and people are going moving fast and slow in this like very intricate ballet, and also she has to like have one world eat another. That part was difficult for me, but not
Mm.
the writing up. Um, but for me, it was actually the character. The character dictates so much of the plot for me. Like
Mm.
how she feels changes everything about what she's going to look at and what she's going to do. And until I had a sense of her own complicity and what was going on, I didn't know what would happen next. For the longest time, I just thought she's a mom and she's trying to give her daughter the perfect day. Like, what a sweet thing. And it's only when she tries to reboot her that things get complicated. But once I latched onto, oh, it's about her own complicity, it's about her guilt again, then I was able to all of the ways she thought that she had failed her daughter and had been this whole time, but hadn't. And from there, I wrote into all of these worlds.
That sounds so good, but so heartbreaking. So, without spoiling anything, because I don't think a lot of members of our chat today have read Times Agent yet, you should. Um, do you have a specific scene that, like, really stuck with you or that you are attached to that you feel is almost like the emotional crux of the book for you?
Yeah, there are a lot of really interesting scenes in the book. There's one in which she goes into a mermaid, and it's a world she's visited before, though she doesn't realize it at first. And the plot of her visit to that particular world centers around the last mermaid of that world. And it's a little boy that um, a long time ago she saw him as a little boy, but now when she goes back in, he's the last mermaid, he's a man, and she realizes a lot of things about him in particular, but also the sorrow of he's got his own language to do with tail flicks. Like they use sign language and tail language. And there's this boy who's not a mermaid, who's a human, who ends up trying to communicate with him by using this tail flicks by like wearing a skirt and trying to flick it in the same way, and just loves this mermaid. And the way what happens in that scene and how she ends up interacting with the wind feels like the heart of it all. She basically sees her daughter in that boy. She sees herself, but also what she's done to this guy. And I think that scene in particular was really heartbreaking for me.
Oh, that sounds like it. Oh, see, this is why everyone should read it. Oh, so what are you working on now? Do you have any upcoming projects or are you kind of taking a break? Times Agent just came out quite recently, right?
Yes, Time Agent came out in August, And I actually cheated on the novel that I have been writing for, at this point, over a decade with Times 8. So now I'm hoping to finish this new novel, and it's about the 1905 Civil War in the Dominican. And a girl, the all possible future, is trying to save her mother because she sees that her mother will likely die, and she's a combatant in the war, and she's trying to mastermind all these people with powers across the city of Santo Domingo to arrive at the scene of her mother's death and try to save.
So more heartbreak is what I'm hearing.
I mean, I laugh. So this is all I've got.
Nah, I think you could if you wanted to. You are ambitious and determined enough. I think you could do anything you wanted to. But I guess this kind of goes back to how how do you know like when a story is ready and when you need to set it aside and maybe work on something different for a while before coming back? You it sounds like you've had such a non-linear course with so many of your stories. Like you published so many short stories and it was only later that you ended up collecting some of them into a collection, and the novella started as a short story that you eventually expanded upon. Like how do you kind of determine like with any story, like whether or not to keep working on it or whether to develop it or whether it should be put away?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Recently, I have discovered that I have ADHD, which makes so much sense now. But I, my writing process when I was writing those short stories was I would have 10 tabs of different Word documents open, all of different. I would get an idea, I would open a Word document, but I would never close it. So I would just have all of these tabs open on my computer, and the second I would get stuck on one, I'd just say, okay, on to the next, and then do the next. So sometimes I'd be cycling through like
Oh,
five or
wow.
six of those given day. And the ADHD makes so much sense now. But I think it's that feeling of like needing to be moving. I don't like feeling stuck. But I will also journal through a short story. And I think I can feel when I don't, when a story isn't, there's some roadblock. And usually it's because I haven't figured out the character enough that I know what their heartbreak is. Like I've got a plot, cool character traits, some interesting things that happen on page one and an interesting voice. But if I don't yet have that character's heart breakdown, I don't know what I'm writing towards, and so I just feel at sea. When I feel at sea, I just stop because I know there's something I haven't gotten yet. It's not something I can just write through or push through. So I'll journal or I'll write onto a different story and maybe something has clicked, or sometimes I'll be laying in a hammock and suddenly that heartbreak will click for me. Um, but I also think that I feel like so many of my stories aren't done. They just get published. And so I stop.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, when The Rock Eaters was published and you had completely revised some of these stories like from scratch, did you feel that those were done or did those also just feel that they were published?
They're published. Yeah.
Wow, that's wild to think after the amount of revisions you talked about going through with them.
They can always, sometimes I'll be reading out loud and I might have read the story 20 times to an audience. And on the 21st time, I'll think, ah, this paragraph should definitely be different. Or, I never needed that sentence, did I? And so it's always in flux.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. Oh, someone asked, what would you say is the most important advice you give to an aspiring writer?
That's a, okay, that's a great question. I think there's a few things I would say is one, no one in the world is waiting for you to write your book except you. What that means is write the best book you can. 'Cause nobody's Nobody's waiting for it. Nobody has a timer on it. Nobody's telling you like finish this in 1 year or else, unless you have a publishing contract, and then there is an or else. Um, Take your time with your writing. Write every day if you can, though that's not always possible. Um, and think of it as, and here's the other advice is write with joy. So many people write because they think they should write or they have to write or it becomes a kind of work that they don't necessarily even like doing, like the idea of it. And if you're not viewing the actual writing as the work as the joy, it's not going to feel fulfilling for you. And then even if you do, some people do write and it's just work and they get published and it's just work. But then when they get that book, all of their identity is hanging on this idea of publication because the joy of the writing wasn't there. So they're thinking, if I get my first book published, that'll make this worthwhile or meaningful or finally like inspire me with. And then what usually happens is people get their first book published and crickets. It's a really anticlimactic event because nothing happens. One day your book is not out, and then the next day your book is out. And if your family and friends are great, they'll throw you a party, and then nothing happens after that. You might do some readings, and then maybe no one shows up. Maybe some people do, and then a lot more of nothing happens. And then you just think, okay, well, I've got to write the next book now to like chase this idea of publication. Anyway, the point is, spend your time with the writing, feeling that joy of what you're doing. Like a lot of people don't get the time to write and don't get that spark of creativity that allows them to think up of stories. And I think that's what's fulfilling in a writing life. So those are my two pieces of advice. Is find joy in the process of the writing and take your time with it. Be patient.
Oh, that is such excellent advice, especially because as someone who kind of went through that experience where when I was like younger, I feel like I enjoyed just the writing itself so much more. And then the older I got and the better, or I guess better I got at writing, the more I felt like, oh, well, I have to be published to validate any of what I'm doing. Like it just added so much stress and almost killed like the joy that I had for writing. And it took a very long time after that to realize that publication was not the end goal. Like it's not going to bring the joy back to writing, and it's not going to make you a more or less valid writer. It should be about the writing first and foremost. So I just love hearing that advice. I think it's truly amazing. So,
And it happens to everyone I've talked to who's had a first book published talks about that experience of instead of the excitement that you always imagine, the disappointment, which is such an emotional term.
yes, and I feel like it's something we don't really talk about a whole lot because no one wants to admit that like they didn't have that joy when their book came out, or they feel like they can't say actually it was disappointing because then it sounds ungrateful because you got a book published, and there are so many writers who would love to have their book published. So it feels like this almost difficult topic to talk about without sounding either ungrateful or as if like you just don't understand. But yeah, I think it's I love how much you have talked about finding the joy in the writing tonight because I feel like you can just tell how passionate you are about like all of your stories and writing itself just from the way you talk, and I love that. I hope we have more of that in the world. So, what are you up to now? And is there anything upcoming? You said you just recently started teaching at a new school, right?
Yeah, I'm now at the University of South Florida in Tampa. We have an MFA and would love applications from anyone who's interested in MFAs. And what else am I doing? I recently had two kids, so there's a lot that is not happening in my life.
Oh, that's so exciting, though. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I hope you're able to settle in at USF well, and I, uh, I don't know how you do it with two kids with as much as you do, so I wish you the best of luck in everything.
Thank- Yeah, me neither. Thanks a lot. You me on the podcast. Thanks for the encouragement.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you so much for giving us your time and all of your amazing advice. It's always just amazing to hear you speak at all. Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.
You too.
Ah, that was so good. Oh my god. I'm still so nervous. I feel like I sounded like such an idiot. Why am I like this, chat? Why am I like this? Oh my gosh, she's so cool. Ah! I think I threw her off when I greeted her so excitedly. I think. And then I got startled because I realized I startled her, and I. Oh. So good at explaining? Yes. This is why she was one of the best professors I ever had. You weren't kidding. She started off rocking my world with the logic bit. I told you! She says the most mind-blowing shit as if it's like the most casual thing in the world, and meanwhile your brain is like trying to reorganize itself to accept like this amazing thing she has just told you. It's insane! I do not use the word brilliant lightly. She is just in a league of her own. She's so intelligent, and like, oh, when she talked about heartbreak, when you read her stories, they are genuinely heartbreaking. They are so good. Oh, and sometimes hit a little too close to home. Oh, but, they're so good. Oh my god, I love her. She's so amazing. I don't think you weirded her out. She looked happy to be here. Maybe she just hides it very well. Oh, I love her. You guys have to read her stories. They're so good. I highly recommend them. Like, I highly recommend all of the authors' works that I bring on, but Brenda's have a very special place in my heart. They're just so good. Like, she can somehow, like, even with, like, all these magic and, like, fantastical elements, she somehow makes, like, realistic heartbreak all the more, like, profound and heartbreaking through these fantastical elements. Like, she's a magician. I believe it. I think the purple hair weirded her out. Yeah, when she said that, I was like, how do I respond to this? Good interview and good job holding in your fangirl. Thanks. I mean, I worked with her for like 2 years, so I feel like she knows. She knows. But I felt like I should make it seem like a semi-professional interview, you know. I can't just fangirl the entire time. I'll just do that to her in private. Oh yeah, if you do want to find previous episodes, these segments are turned into podcast episodes after, called Talk Story to Me, on Spotify, YouTube, and newly on Apple. I finally figured out how to do the it, so I did the it. Oh, but yeah, thank you guys for hanging out with me and doing all the fun author interview things. I always appreciate when you guys are here, because I always worry that, like, I'm the only one who's enjoying these, so it's always, like, very happy making when there are others here just hanging out and listening with me. Oh. She's so good. The kitten, she gave some really good advice. Yeah, that was one of the, other than the fact that she's brilliant, that was one of the reasons I really wanted to have Brenda on, because she's so good at, like, she's very experienced, I would say, with, like, teaching and instruction, and I kind of knew that even if we could only talk to her for, like, 50 minutes, an hour, she was going to have, like, really amazing things to say, and really helpful things if anyone is an aspiring writer. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight. I had so much fun, and I hope I will see you all next time.